Florida lawmakers just approved one of the biggest property tax changes in Florida's history. If Florida voters approve this in November of 2026, millions of homeowners could see their property taxes drop quite a bit. DeSantis's initial proposal changed dramatically actually during the legislative process. So for one, schools were carved out, and that is such a significant change because school taxes typically make up a large portion of many Florida property tax bills. In some cases it could be 40%, 50%, depends on the location, but it is a pretty large portion, and that's now set aside. That change in itself to me has been so dramatic that a year ago, when we were having that conversation of eliminating property taxes on homes, I didn't think that was going to be possible because of the gap. But now schools are carved out, and we're only talking about homesteaded properties. First, let me just show you a real Sarasota property tax bill, because I think this is where the conversation finally starts to make sense. When people hear the phrase property tax relief or property tax elimination, many assume their entire tax bill disappears. But that is not really what this proposal is targeting. Take a look at this random Sarasota County tax bill. Up here, you have the ad valorem taxes. These are taxes based on property value. This is where the homestead exemption and Save Our Homes come into play. Notice the school taxes right here. School taxes were largely carved out of the final proposal, and in this example, account for almost 50% of the entire tax bill. In fact, school taxes are often one of the largest portions of a Florida property tax bill, as I mentioned earlier. So even under the expanded exemption, those taxes generally remain. Then down here, you have the non-ad valorem assessments, things like fire rescue, solid waste, and stormwater. These charges are not directly tied to your property's value, and many of them appear unaffected by the amendment as written. So when people hear that Florida is eliminating property taxes, many assume their entire bill will disappear. Most homeowners would still see some charges on their home bill, even if this passes. And this is so important to really understand because it helps explain why the debate has shifted. The question is no longer, can Florida replace all property taxes, because not all property taxes are actually on the line. The question now is, how can Florida replace the non-school local government revenue that would be reduced under the expanded homestead exemption? And just so you know, I own a home here in Sarasota and I have a homestead exemption. And if this passes, I'm sure I'm going to be saving quite a bit of money. And so when I tell you I still have questions of how this is going to work in the long term, I hope that means something coming from me as someone that could potentially be saving quite a bit of money. You probably know this, but just in case, Florida does not levy a traditional statewide property taxes. Property taxes are primarily collected and distributed at the local level. They fund county, city, school districts, fire departments, roads, parks, and emergency services. Right now, local governments in Florida collect around $60 billion a year in property taxes, which is up from $32 billion in 2029. This is really according to figures cited by Governor DeSantis. His office is projecting that that number increase in 2032 to $83 billion approximately. Before we talk about what passed in more detail, there are a couple of things about how Florida property taxes actually work that I think it's important for us all to understand. Florida has something called a Save Our Homes cap. And here's what that means. Simply stated, if you own your home and it is your primary residence, what is called a homestead, the taxable value of your home can only go up by a maximum of 3% per year, or the rate of inflation, whichever is lower. Now, there's going to be some exceptions. Big renovations or additions can affect it. And when a property is sold, this is really important. When a property is sold, the cap resets entirely for the new buyer at the current market values. It really is kind of useless to look at what the seller is currently paying for property taxes because it's going to reset, and in some cases the new buyer may be paying way more than what the current seller is paying in property taxes, especially when they've owned their home for a longer period of time and they purchased it at a much lower price years ago and it's homesteaded. What did actually get approved in the beginning of June? Right now, Florida homeowners can reduce their taxable assessed value by up to $50,000 through the homestead exemption. How much it actually saves you depends on your county and local millage rate. But what was approved would dramatically expand that. The actual bill number is HJR 1F, and that's what Florida voters are going to be voting on in November 2026. It requires 60% voter approval to pass, which from what I'm reading is considered a high bar. The homestead exemption would increase to $150,000 starting January 1st, 2027. So they're going to be taking a phased approach. 1 year later, it increases to $250,000 starting January 1st, 2028. And then beyond that, further increases will be tied to consumer price index. Here are a few important details about what's passed. So as I mentioned earlier, the school district taxes are protected. The amendment also limits how counties and municipalities may use the remaining ad valorem tax revenue, really directing it towards core public needs such as public safety, education, infrastructure, natural resource projects, debt obligations, retirement obligations, and local government operations. The non-homestead assessment cap also changes. So in other words, right now, the investment properties, vacation homes that are not homestead, so they would be able to see an increase in their property taxes by up to 10% per year. That is actually getting pushed down to 5%. So this is a potential another funding gap of revenue that needs to be accounted for. Now here's something really important to note. If you're somebody that is looking to purchase a home, say in 2027, and this property tax bill actually moves through, you're not going to be able to benefit from it right away. You would have to live in that home for at least 5 years. According to a House staff analysis cited by multiple Florida news outlets, the proposal is estimated to reduce non-school local government revenue by roughly $4.6 billion the first year and approximately $8.4 billion in the second year. That is not a one-time cost. That is going to be reoccurring every single year. And so to be fair, these estimates are substantially lower than earlier discussions. But even then, some local officials and analysts have warned that certain counties could potentially see substantial revenue reductions under the proposal, depending on their tax structure and reliance on homesteaded property revenue. Now, this is also important to note that Florida has strong reserves and has run significant budget surpluses in recent years, a place that we can draw from in case there's not enough money that is coming in from property taxes. But it's also fair to say that reserves are not the same as a recurring annual revenue. The more you take out, the more it's going to get depleted. And so eventually it will run out if we keep taking from it, unless the gap is filled by other sources or we give up services. Here's what I need to understand before November. So the amendment right now places greater emphasis on using property tax revenue for core services. Supporters see this as fiscal responsibility. Critics worry that it could gradually reduce local flexibility and shift more financial control towards Tallahassee. Do we want this? I don't know. And I think that's a fair debate for voters to vote on. So we've talked about how we don't really know where the money is going to come from to fill that gap, but where are some potential areas it could come from? So I'm going to talk about three main options. There's certainly going to be more, but here are three main options that get tossed around a lot. And the first option is raise the sales tax. So Florida already collected approximately $40 billion in sales and gross receipt taxes in 2024, which is the single biggest source of state revenue, that is sales tax. Florida already relies heavily on sales taxes because the state has no personal income tax. If the sales tax eventually increases to help offset part of the funding gap, everyone pays, including renters who receive no direct homestead benefit from this proposal. None whatsoever. This is going to be one of the core debates that people are going to have over the next few months, I'm sure. And that is if sales taxes, increasing it, becomes the major mechanism of how to close that gap, then the question also is who's going to benefit and who's not. And we already know that the homeowner who has a homestead property is going to be benefiting quite a bit from this potential change. And renters don't have a direct benefit. And so the burden of making sure that this gap is closed through sales taxes is really going to shift much more towards renters because they're otherwise not getting any benefit from the bill. This is where some of the critics argue the proposal could gradually function as a form of cost shifting. Number 2 is tourism. Florida has an incredible tourism economy, but it is volatile. Think recessions, hurricanes, and pandemics. There are certain events that could hit that revenue coming in very quickly, but it also could help fill some of that gap. Absolutely. Option 3, if revenue does not get replaced, eventually something gets cut. That's just the reality of how budgets work. Now, to be fair, sales and tourism taxes are not the only possible sources of replacement funding. But what's probably going to happen is that Florida is going to be utilizing a combination of increases in sales taxes, tourism related taxes. Perhaps they're going to be taking gaming or lottery revenue up. Hopefully we'll have economic growth. But it would be nice to see a plan of how they're intending to close the gap, and that is exactly what we're still missing. Now I really want to talk about renters. Roughly 1 out of 3 households right now in Florida, they're renting rather than owning, and every single one of these folks are getting essentially zero benefit from this. But here is the domino effects, and could possibly be even worse on renters and also those purchasing a home in Florida. So if this passes, Florida is going to be known not only as the state that has no state income tax, but if we have this dramatically reduction in property taxes, more and more people are going to want to live in Florida. Retirees, remote workers, investors already looking at Florida to begin with. Now all of a sudden they're going to have yet another major financial incentive, and when demand rises faster than supply, it's supply and demand law, prices will go up. And so if essential workers get priced out, businesses and governments eventually have to pay more to attract and keep them. Those higher labor costs flow right back to higher prices for everything: goods, services, construction, healthcare, and just everyday living. So I really think that looking at the property tax system right now is good. It deserves another look. And I really believe that eliminating spending in places it would be considered waste is smart, making it more efficient where we're spending our money in. But before I can confidently vote on this and feel really good about this, I personally would want to see a detailed, independent model showing exactly what the financial gap is going to be and how it's going to be filled once the reserves are to zero or lower. I mean, ultimately, I think it's smart to have reserve money because we just don't know. We could have another hurricane. There could be a disaster for which we need money. So I would just want to see, how do we close that gap? So now that this moves to Florida voters in November 2026, we have enough time still to be able to get a lot more clarity in terms of how this is really going to work. And I believe that Florida voters deserve it before they're actually heading into the voting booth. Now I have a question for you, and I would love to have your input on it. If you don't know how they're going to be closing this gap in November, would you still vote for this? Leave me a comment in the comment section. And if you have any questions in terms of what this could mean for buying or selling right now in Sarasota specifically, which is the market I work in, you can find my contact information in the description section below. Thank you so much for watching today. I always appreciate it, and I wish you all a great day.